All right, so today I'm watching this video. It's a financial channel and I watch. It's actually a precious metals channel. I'm a big fan of gold and silver, by the way, and so I like to follow the financial news, and in particular financial news as it relates to gold and silver. So I'm watching this video, and it's a video channel. It's a YouTube channel that I watch quite a bit. They've got a lot of good programming on there. And they had a guest on there today who I think is one of my favorite guests. He's somebody who he's an investment manager. He's a smart guy, as most investment managers are. And he's also somebody who's willing to, he's also an honest guy. And I don't know that investment managers are always honest. He's got a good understanding of economics, too, for the most part. And that's not always the case. You might think that being an investment manager and having a sound grasp on economics will go together, but that's not always the case. But this fellow does, and I admire his work, and I'm not going to use his name today because I'm going to take issue with something that he said because I really like his work, and so I don't want to make this about him. I really want to make this about an idea. And the idea has to do with Bitcoin. The title of this talk is Bitcoin and Biblical Economics. And this gentleman who is speaking today, he made it very clear that he doesn't like Bitcoin. Now, that's not the issue that I have with him. I think there's some legitimate concerns, legitimate reasons someone can give for not liking Bitcoin. So it's not the fact that he doesn't like Bitcoin per se that caused me to question what he's saying. It's actually the reason that he gave for not liking Bitcoin. It was interesting. The subject of Bitcoin came up, and not only did he not like Bitcoin, in fact, I would even say he was actually hostile to Bitcoin. At one point, he finally declared, he said, Bitcoin can go to $100,000, and it can do it without me. Harumph, harumph, you know. It's kind of a pretty extreme reaction from this fellow. But as I said, it's not the fact that he doesn't like Bitcoin or even the fact that he really, really, really doesn't like Bitcoin that is caused me to raise some questions about what he said. It's about something else that he said, and it had to do with this. He was describing Bitcoin. He was talking about, well, what Bitcoin is. And in Bitcoin, if you follow this at all, what it is, it's a mathematical formula. And what he said it's actually a string of 64 characters, letters and numbers, and that each Bitcoin is identified by this unique 64 character string. And then he raised this point. This is what he said. He said, this stuff has no intrinsic value. It's just letters and numbers. What kind of intrinsic value does that have compared to gold? Now, the way that he asked this question, and it's sort of a rhetorical question, the way he asked that, the conclusion he wanted you to take away from that is that the intrinsic value of gold is maybe way up here, and the intrinsic value of Bitcoin is maybe way down here. I want to pause on that idea, the whole idea of intrinsic value, because this is really what I want to talk about. Intrinsic value. Now, you may be asking yourself, okay, so what on earth is intrinsic value? Well, intrinsic value is a concept in economics that goes back to Aristotle. Aristotle wrote a book called The Politics. He didn't write a particular book on economics, but he wrote a book called The Politics. And in The Politics, he set forth four major economic ideas, one of which was intrinsic value. Now, Aristotle's philosophy has really ruled economic thought from the day that he wrote that book some, 2,500 years ago, all the way up into the present. And his main ideas, his four main ideas, have really been picked up and propagated by economists ever since. Thomas Aquinas, the medieval Roman Catholic scholar, was a big fan of Aristotle, and the schoolmen, the scholastics that followed him, also were big in promoting Aristotle's ideas. So naturally, they promoted the idea of intrinsic value. So what is intrinsic value? Let's talk about that a little bit. Intrinsic value is this idea, it's this notion, it's kind of like what it sounds like. Intrinsic value is the idea that things are valuable because they have some sort of inherent quality in them. You may ask, well, why is gold valuable and water isn't? I mean, gold. I mean, you can't eat gold, you can't drink gold. Gold doesn't necessarily. You can survive without gold. On the one hand, gold is maybe a little bit of a luxury. On the other hand, water is a necessity, right? You have to have water to live. However, gold is really expensive. Water, for the most part, is pretty cheap. This was a big question that came up in the 19th century. Why are things like gold or diamonds? I think in the 19th century they like to say, why are diamonds so expensive, so valuable, and why is water so cheap? And people labored and they struggled with this idea because they had this concept of intrinsic value. They said that the value of something is actually inherent, intrinsic. It's naturally part of the thing itself. Well, that's an error, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. But this gentleman, when I was watching his video, he said this. He made that rhetorical question. He says, "Well, what's the intrinsic value of a string of letters and numbers compared to the intrinsic value of gold?" And as I said, he wanted you to reach this conclusion that well, there's no comparison. That the intrinsic value of gold is way high, the intrinsic value of Bitcoin is way down here. But here's the actual true answer to his question. The intrinsic value of Bitcoin and the intrinsic value of gold are exactly the same. Zero in both cases. Bitcoin has no intrinsic value. Gold has no intrinsic value. Now, that probably is surprising to a lot of people because, again, we tend to grow up and we tend to hear, we tend to absorb from society this idea that there is that intrinsic value, that's the reason why certain things are valuable. Value, the correct answer to this, it's called the theory of subjective value. Now, I want to say something here. Sometimes we talk about values, we talk about family values or Christian values. I don't want you to get the idea that I'm saying that values, that morals, that ethics are subjective. They're not. When we talk about ethics, ethics are objective. Proper ethics, are based upon the law of God. So values in that sense, in the ethical sense, are not subjective. But economic value is subjective. Value is not in the thing itself. Value, the reason Bitcoins are valuable, the reason gold is valuable, the reason one thing goes up in value, the reason something else goes down in value, is not because of anything inherent in the thing itself. The reason that anything is valuable, Bitcoin, gold, or whatever, the reason anything is valuable is because people impute value to it. Value is imputed, value is ascribed, value is reckoned. There's a parallel to this in Christian theology. If you're familiar with Christian theology, we talk about imputed righteousness, right? We say that God justifies a sinner, that God pronounces a sinner righteous because he imputes the righteousness of Christ to that sinner. God is perfectly holy, and all of us, even the best of us, are miserable sinners. And when we come to faith in Christ, we're still miserable sinners. But God accepts us not because of something in us, not because we're so valuable, not because we're perfect, but because we have faith in Christ. And when we have faith in Christ, what God does is say that my son, who is perfectly righteous, who kept the law perfectly, is without sin. What I'm going to do, because you as a sinner have faith in my son, that I'm going to impute, I'm going to ascribe, I'm going to reckon his righteousness to you. Now, you don't actually have that righteousness. It's not yours. The righteousness belongs to Christ. But he's going to look at us, at the believer, as though that person actually really had done all of Christ's righteous works. It's called imputed righteousness. We're not righteous in ourselves, but we have a righteous standing before God because God ascribes Christ's righteousness to us. He credits it to us. That's another way you could say he credits the righteousness of Christ to us. Value works the same way. We're talking about economic value here again. The simple truth is that things are valuable because people value them. Just like sinners are considered righteousness in the sight of God because God imputes righteousness to them, things are valuable, whether it's Bitcoin, whether it's gold, whether it's a Mercedes-Benz or a Rolex watch. Things are valuable because people value them. People impute, ascribe, reckon, credit value to those things. And this is a concept that a lot of people, unfortunately, do not get. And a lot of people who otherwise are pretty sound economic thinkers. I can't tell you how many times I've seen people who are, so-called gold bugs, right? People who value gold and silver. And I'm one. I love gold and silver. I'm a huge fan of gold and silver. If you don't have gold and silver, get some. If you don't know how to buy gold and silver, you need to learn how to buy it. Now, maybe that's a subject for another video, and I think I'd like to make those videos, but I don't want to get too far off on that tangent for now. But what I do want you to remember is that value is not inherent. There's no such thing as intrinsic value. Value is ascribed, value is imputed, value is reckoned. Things are valuable, all things, whether that's Bitcoin, whether that's gold, whether that's silver or anything else, things are valuable because people value them. That's the biblical answer. That's the Christian answer. Anyway, thanks for taking the time to watch this video. If you did like it, please subscribe. This is Steve Matthews. I'll talk to you again soon. Good night.